Can you read this letter? It's important. Black Waitress's daughter made the billionaire CEO cry. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's dive into the story. This is a tale that starts in a quiet, elegant restaurant, one of the finest in downtown San Francisco. The lights are dim, and the air is filled with the sound of soft jazz, crystal glasses clinking, and the murmurs of the city's wealthiest and most influential. But in the midst of all this luxury, there was a storm brewing, a storm that no one could have predicted. At the center of it all was a tall, well-dressed man, Richard Kesler, a billionaire CEO known for his sharp mind and ruthless business strategies. He sat at the head of a polished walnut table, his demeanor cold and calculating, surrounded by power players from various industries. The energy in the room was palpable, each conversation dripping with the anticipation of high-stakes deals. But in the corner, standing in stark contrast to the opulence, was a young black waitress named Cassandra, doing her best to remain unnoticed as she moved between the tables. Cassandra had been working at Waitress Lounge for years, and she knew how to blend into the background. Her uniform was pressed, her movements swift, and her smile polite, but it was always the same, subdued, quiet, invisible. That was her role in this world. She was part of the service, the backdrop of these high-profile events, expected to be seen but not heard. But that night, something was different. Richard Kesler, who rarely spared a glance for anyone in his path, suddenly directed a cutting remark her way. "Did you spill that?" he asked sharply, his voice carrying across the room. It wasn't a question, but an accusation. Cassandra paused, startled by the sudden attention. She glanced down at the small spill of sparkling water on the white linen tablecloth. It was a minor mistake, but Richard's voice was filled with disdain. "Of course, it's never your fault, is it?" His words dripped with contempt, as if her mere presence, her very being, was an inconvenience to him. The room fell silent for a brief moment, and all eyes turned towards her. Cassandra, however, didn't flinch. She had learned long ago that her worth was never measured by the mistakes others saw in her. But the sting of his words was sharp, and that was when it happened. From the corner of the room, a small figure stood up. Amara, Cassandra's 10-year-old daughter, who had been quietly sitting in a booth, watching as her mother worked, stood tall, her eyes fixed on Richard. With calm determination, she walked across the floor and stood beside her mother, facing the CEO. Amara, with the same quiet strength her mother had taught her, looked up at Richard and said, "My mother may not play chess, but I do." The words hung in the air, and for the first time that night, Richard Kesler's smirk faltered. The room seemed to hold its breath. Amara, no older than 10, had just defied one of the wealthiest men in the world. But she didn't do it out of anger. She did it with the poise of someone who knew her own worth. As she stood there, waiting for his response, the room around them seemed to shrink, and Richard's gaze softened, his eyes narrowing in disbelief. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this was more than just a game. It was about dignity, respect, and the unexpected power of a child who refused to be underestimated. This was only the beginning. As the room stood still, the tension was thick enough to cut through. Richard Kesler, the billionaire CEO, was still processing what had just happened. A 10-year-old girl, no older than his own daughter, had just stepped up to challenge him in front of his business associates and all the other high-profile guests at Waitress Lounge. His smirk slowly faded, replaced by an unreadable expression. Amara stood there, unwavering, her tiny frame a stark contrast to the towering figure of Richard. The murmurs in the room grew louder, but Amara remained calm, her voice steady as she repeated, "My mother may not play chess, but I do." Cassandra, still stunned, felt a pang of pride mixed with fear. She wanted to pull her daughter back, to shield her from the spotlight, but something inside her stopped her. Amara wasn't afraid. She wasn't backing down, and neither was she going to let Richard Kesler, or anyone, belittle her mother any longer. Richard finally broke the silence, his voice laced with sarcasm. Well, a chess player. Let's see what you've got." he said, pulling out a chair and making a show of taking a seat at the nearby marble chessboard. His hands rested on the smooth surface of the board as he waited for Amara to join him, a smug grin forming on his face. But Amara didn't move immediately. She glanced at her mother, who gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. Cassandra knew her daughter's mind was made up. Amara walked toward the chair, her steps measured, and took her seat across from Richard. "I accept your challenge," she said, her voice soft but firm. The crowd fell silent again. The other guests, still unsure of what was happening, watched with bated breath as the game unfolded. Richard, with his years of experience playing in exclusive country clubs and boardrooms, began the game with his signature move. He moved his pawn, eager to show this child just how easy it would be to win. But Amara didn't rush. She took a moment to study the board, her eyes sharp, calculating her next move. Richard, underestimating her, made a quick counterattack, pushing his knight into a seemingly dominant position. "You're making a mistake," he muttered, not expecting her to respond. Amara, however, didn't flinch. She moved her pawn, shifting the balance of power on the board. Her move was precise, confident. Richard's eyes narrowed. He had expected her to crumble under the pressure, but instead, she was playing him just like he played everyone else. Calm, methodical, and with purpose. The game went on, each move from Amara making Richard more and more uncomfortable. He began to sweat slightly, his usual confidence slipping away as he realized he wasn't facing a child at all. He was facing someone who had studied the game, someone who understood it in a way that few ever would. Amara's moves were subtle yet brilliant, her strategy unfolding like a delicate dance. She had studied the game for years with her grandmother, who had taught her the rules not only of chess but of life. Her grandmother had always said, "Chess is a game of patience, of strategy. You wait for your moment, and when it comes, you strike." Richard, on the other hand, was used to making decisions quickly, dominating the board with sheer force. But this time, it was his arrogance that was his undoing. As the game continued, more and more guests began to watch, their phones now in hand, ready to capture the shocking moment that was unfolding before them. Richard's moves became desperate, but Amara's were calculated and deliberate. The tension in the room was palpable, and even Richard's most loyal associates seemed to be holding their breath, unsure of how this would end. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Amara made her move. It was a checkmate. Richard's eyes widened in disbelief as he stared at the board, realizing that a 10-year-old girl had just beaten him at his own game. He sat there in stunned silence for a moment, the room around him erupting into murmurs of shock. His face flushed with embarrassment. He had been outplayed, not by a seasoned chess master, but by a child. The crowd couldn't believe their eyes. Amara had done what no one had thought possible. Richard Kesler, the billionaire CEO, had lost to a little girl. As Amara sat back in her chair, her expression remained calm. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply looked at Richard, her eyes steady, as if to say, "You underestimated me, and now you see who I am." The room fell silent again, but this time, the silence was filled with a sense of respect. Richard's hand slowly dropped to his side as he realized the weight of what had just happened. It wasn't just a game of chess. It was a lesson in humility, and it was a lesson he would never forget. The silence that followed the game was deafening. Richard Kesler, the billionaire CEO, sat frozen, unable to comprehend what had just happened. He had been beaten at chess, not by an experienced player, but by a young girl who had been working quietly as a waitress just moments before. The room, which had once buzzed with the sounds of high-stakes business and polished conversations, was now completely still. The air felt heavy, as if the power in the room had shifted entirely. For the first time that evening, Richard's confidence had been shaken. He glanced around, trying to regain his composure, but the looks of disbelief from the other guests were impossible to ignore. Amara, on the other hand, remained calm. She didn't smile, she didn't boast. She simply sat back in her chair, her eyes steady as she looked at Richard, who was still processing the shocking defeat. Amara knew what this moment meant. It wasn't just about winning a game. It was about something deeper. She had just proven that even the smallest person, the one who was always overlooked, had power. Power that no amount of money or arrogance could dismiss. Richard finally found his voice, but it was weak, almost apologetic. I never thought. He started, trailing off as he realized he didn't have the words to finish. You thought what? Amara asked, her voice quiet but firm. Richard cleared his throat, straightening up in his seat, attempting to regain some semblance of his former self. I underestimated you, he admitted, the words tasting bitter as they left his mouth. And I made a mistake. There was a long pause. The other guests in the room, still stunned by what they had just witnessed, exchanged looks with each other, as if trying to make sense of the scene that had just unfolded before them. Amara didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She had already said everything with her actions. Richard glanced over at Cassandra, Amara's mother, who had been standing in the corner, watching the entire game unfold. His eyes softened as he acknowledged her presence for the first time that night. I owe you an apology as well, he said, his tone more sincere than it had been all evening. I've been rude, and I have no excuse. Cassandra, who had spent years in the background of these high-end events, never receiving the recognition she deserved, looked at him coolly. It's not just an apology that's needed, she replied, her voice calm yet piercing. You need to understand that the people you look down on are not beneath you. They are the ones who keep everything running. Without us, you wouldn't be sitting here at this table. Richard was taken aback. He had always been surrounded by yes-men, people who were afraid to challenge him, and yet here was this woman, a waitress, speaking to him as if he were the one who had something to learn. You're right, he said quietly, looking at her with newfound respect. I've spent my life thinking I was above people like you. He paused, his gaze shifting to Amara, who was still seated across from him. And now I realize just how wrong I've been. The room was silent again, but this time, it was a different kind of silence. The guests weren't just stunned by the game. They were now witnessing something else, a powerful lesson in humility. Richard Kesler, the billionaire CEO, was acknowledging his own flaws, his own prejudices. It was a rare moment, one that didn't happen often in the world of high finance and power. Amara stood up, breaking the silence. She didn't need his apology. What she needed was for people like him to change, to recognize that power wasn't just about money and influence. It was about understanding and respect. You'll be fine, she said, looking him straight in the eye. But remember this moment. It's not about how much money you have. It's about how you treat the people around you. With that, she turned and walked away, her mother following closely behind. The guests in the room were still processing what they had just witnessed. They had come to the restaurant expecting to witness a high-profile business deal, but what they had witnessed instead was far more important. They had seen a powerful man, brought to his knees not by a great deal, but by a 10-year-old girl who refused to be underestimated. As Cassandra and Amara left the room, the whispers started. Some guests were already pulling out their phones, eager to share the story of the evening. The billionaire CEO had been humbled, and the world was going to know about it. Richard sat back in his chair, finally understanding the weight of his own words and actions. He had spent his life building an empire based on control and power, but in this moment, he had learned something far more valuable. Power wasn't just something you held over others. It was something you earned by respecting them, by recognizing their worth. As the evening went on, Richard found himself reflecting on what had just transpired. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but one thing was certain. His perspective had changed forever. As Cassandra and Amara left the restaurant that evening, the city of San Francisco seemed different. The usual bustling energy of the streets, the hum of luxury cars and the chatter of the elite, all seemed muted. It wasn't the fog that had rolled in, but the weight of the events that had just unfolded in the high-end restaurant. They had walked out of Waitress Lounge, not only having won a chess game, but also having taken back something that had been denied to them for so long: respect. Amara walked beside her mother, her small figure holding a quiet power that was impossible to ignore. Cassandra, still processing the intensity of the night, couldn't help but glance down at her daughter with admiration. Amara had been the one to stand up to the billionaire CEO, and in that moment, she had shown the world what it meant to be underestimated. Cassandra smiled to herself, knowing that her daughter had learned more than she could ever teach her. The value of holding your ground, of making your voice heard, even in the most impossible of situations. You did great tonight, Cassandra said, her voice filled with pride. Amara simply nodded, her face thoughtful. It wasn't about the game, Mom. It was about making him realize that he doesn't get to decide who's important, she replied, her voice calm but resolute. We're all important. As they made their way back to their modest apartment, the reality of the night began to settle in. Cassandra couldn't help but feel that the world had shifted just a little. She had worked in the service industry for years, serving those who often treated her like she was invisible. The disrespect, the disregard. She had learned to live with it, to swallow it every day. But tonight, her daughter had shown her that there was power in silence, in standing still when the world expected you to fall. And in the process, she had changed the game forever. The next morning, Richard Kesler, the billionaire CEO, couldn't shake what had happened the night before. He had spent hours thinking about it, replaying the game in his mind, trying to understand how a child had beaten him so effortlessly. But it wasn't just the game that had affected him. It was the way Amara had looked at him, the way she had made him feel small, humbled. He wasn't used to that. He was used to being the one who held the power, the one who called the shots. But last night, it had been taken from him, not through wealth or force, but through something far more powerful, humility. Richard knew that he couldn't just let it go. He had to do something about it, something that would show both Amara and her mother that he understood the lesson they had taught him. He decided to visit them, to offer something that would prove he had learned something from their encounter. The knock on their apartment door came late in the afternoon. Cassandra was surprised to find Richard standing there, looking somewhat out of place in the modest hallway. "Mr. Kesler?" she asked, unsure of what to expect. Richard nodded, his expression soft, almost apologetic. "I know this might seem unexpected," he began, his voice sincere. "But I've come to offer an apology, not just for last night, but for the way I've treated people like you and your daughter." He paused, taking a deep breath. "I don't know if I can make up for it, but I want to try." Cassandra, still unsure of his intentions, didn't immediately respond. Amara, who had been sitting in the living room, walked over and stood beside her mother. She looked up at Richard, her expression serious but not unkind. "What do you want, Mr. Kesler?" she asked, her voice steady. Richard looked at her, then at Cassandra, before reaching into his briefcase. He pulled out a check, a large one, more money than they had ever seen in their entire lives. "I want to offer you something," he said, placing the check on the table. "This is for you and your family. It's not just about the money. It's about making things right." Amara's eyes narrowed slightly, her gaze flickering between the check and Richard's face. "And why now?" she asked, still not convinced. "Because," Richard replied, "I've spent too long in my own bubble, thinking I was above everything and everyone. But last night, I saw something I had never seen before, real power. The kind of power that comes from knowing your worth, regardless of who tries to tell you otherwise." He paused, his voice softening. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want to make it right." Amara didn't say anything at first. She simply looked at the check, then at her mother, who had been quiet, processing everything that had just happened. Finally, Amara spoke. "You can't buy respect, Mr. Kesler," she said, her voice steady and sure. "And you can't change the past with money. But you can change how you treat people from now on. That's the real power." Richard looked at her, a sense of understanding crossing his face. "You're right," he said quietly. "I can only start by doing better, by being better." Cassandra nodded slowly, her heart heavy with emotion. "We'll take your apology," she said. "But we don't need your money. We've got enough." Richard nodded, a small smile playing at the corner of his lips. "Then I'll start by changing how I do business, by making sure that everyone, no matter who they are, gets treated with the respect they deserve." With that, he turned and left, leaving Cassandra and Amara standing together, knowing that the world had indeed shifted just a little. And maybe, just maybe, that shift would make all the difference. The days that followed Richard Kesler's visit to Cassandra and Amara were quiet, but they were filled with a sense of change, one that was felt deeply by both mother and daughter. The city of San Francisco, with its usual hustle and bustle, seemed less overwhelming now. It was as if the events of that night had opened their eyes to something bigger, something more meaningful than the usual noise of daily life. Cassandra found herself walking with her head a little higher, her shoulders a little straighter. Amara, too, had a quiet confidence that came from knowing that the world, despite its injustices, could be challenged, and sometimes it would listen. Richard Kesler's apology had left a mark on both of them. Cassandra had been cautious at first, unsure of his intentions, but seeing the sincerity in his eyes had made her believe that maybe, just maybe, he was truly willing to change. She had told him they didn't need his money, but there was something else in his offer that stayed with her, the promise that he would use his power, his influence, for something better. And now, as the days went on, Richard was keeping his word. His company, Kesler Tech, had made a public commitment to change its hiring practices, pledging to create more opportunities for people from underrepresented communities, to stop overlooking talent based on superficial criteria. He had donated to local education programs, focusing on giving children from disadvantaged backgrounds the resources they needed to succeed. Cassandra couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. Maybe the world could change, even if it was only one step at a time. But while Richard was busy trying to make amends, Amara wasn't entirely convinced. She had seen too much of the world's unfairness to think that a few donations and public statements were enough to fix the deeper problems. What bothered her the most was how quickly people seemed to forget the lessons learned from moments like this. It wasn't just about money or gestures. It was about respect, about valuing people for who they were, not for what they could offer. One afternoon, as they were walking through the city, Amara turned to her mother with a serious expression. "Mom, do you think people will really change?" she asked, her voice quiet but heavy with thought. Cassandra looked down at her daughter, surprised by the question. She had always tried to shield Amara from the harsher realities of life, but there was no hiding from the truth now. "I think some people will try," she said slowly. "But change takes time, and it takes more than just a few good deeds. It takes people standing up, like you did." Amara nodded, her gaze distant. "I just want to make sure people remember. I want them to remember that respect is more important than power, that kindness is stronger than money." Cassandra smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "You're right. That's what we have to keep reminding people. That's what makes the world better, one person at a time." Meanwhile, Richard had been reflecting on the words Amara had said to him that night, about how respect couldn't be bought. He had spent a lifetime accumulating wealth and power, but he was slowly beginning to understand that these things didn't define a person. What mattered more was how you treated others, how you used your position to lift up those who had been ignored or overlooked. He hadn't yet fully figured out how to make it all right, but he was starting to see the path ahead. One evening, he invited Cassandra and Amara out for a meal at a quieter restaurant, away from the usual crowd. He wanted to make amends, not just through his words, but through actions. "I've been thinking about what you said, Amara," Richard said as they sat down at the table. "And I want to do more. I want to be a better person, not just a better businessman." Amara didn't say anything at first. She just looked at him, her expression unreadable. Then, after a moment of silence, she spoke. "I think it's great that you want to change, Mr. Kesler. But actions speak louder than words. You have the power to make a real difference, not just in your company, but in the world." Richard nodded, fully aware of how much work was ahead of him. "I know, and I'm committed to making sure I use my position to help people who need it the most." The conversation shifted to lighter topics, but the weight of their words lingered in the air. For Cassandra and Amara, it was clear that change wouldn't happen overnight. But they were no longer just watching from the sidelines. They were part of something bigger, something that had the potential to make a real impact. And with each step they took, they were proving that even the smallest voices could shift the world in ways no one expected. As they left the restaurant that night, Cassandra and Amara shared a quiet moment, walking side by side through the streets of San Francisco, knowing that, no matter how small the change seemed, it was real. It was theirs. In the weeks that followed, Richard Kesler's efforts to change his ways were more than just surface-level gestures. He began to put his words into action. He made changes at Kesler Tech, introducing new hiring policies to ensure people from all walks of life were given opportunities. He also started using his influence to back local initiatives aimed at improving education and healthcare for underprivileged communities. But as he made these changes, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing. He had done the bare minimum, sure, but there was still something about Amara's words that lingered in his mind. "You can't buy respect." Richard had spent his entire life building his empire with money and power, but he had never truly understood the weight of that respect until now. He couldn't just write a check or give a speech and call it a day. He had to show people that he understood the real value of human dignity. One afternoon, Richard invited Cassandra and Amara out again, this time to a community center where he had decided to make a major donation. It wasn't just any donation. It was the beginning of a partnership with local leaders to create real, lasting change. When Cassandra and Amara arrived, they were surprised to find Richard standing in the middle of a small group of children, laughing and talking to them like they were equals, not people he was trying to impress. It was a stark contrast to the cold, calculating businessman they had met at the restaurant all those weeks ago. Richard turned to greet them with a genuine smile. "I'm glad you came," he said. "I wanted you both to see where this all starts." He motioned toward the kids around him, who were engaged in various activities. "These kids, they don't need my money. What they need is someone to believe in them, to show them that they matter." Cassandra and Amara stood in silence, watching as Richard interacted with the children. His demeanor had shifted from the arrogant CEO to someone who was truly invested in making a difference. It was clear that his change of heart wasn't just a temporary shift. It was something deeper, something real. "You've really changed," Amara said, her voice quiet but full of surprise. Richard looked at her, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I think I'm starting to understand what you meant when you said, respect can't be bought." Cassandra nodded, her heart swelling with a quiet pride. "It's not just about the money, is it?" she asked. Richard shook his head. "No. It's about doing what's right, even when no one's watching. It's about earning the respect of people, not because of what you can give them, but because of who you are." For the first time in a long while, Richard felt a sense of peace. He had spent so many years chasing success, chasing power, but now he was finally starting to understand what it truly meant to be successful. It wasn't about the wealth or the status. It was about the lives you touched along the way, the people you helped, and the way you made others feel. As the afternoon wore on, Richard, Cassandra, and Amara sat down in the community center's cafeteria, eating lunch with the children and staff. The conversation was light, and there was laughter in the air, but beneath it all, there was a deep sense of satisfaction. Richard knew that the journey wasn't over yet. He had a long way to go before he could fully redeem himself in the eyes of those he had wronged, but he was committed to the path ahead. It wasn't going to be easy. He couldn't change everything overnight. But he had learned something important that day. Change wasn't about grand gestures or public acts. It was about small, consistent actions that built trust over time. That evening, as Cassandra and Amara headed home, they talked about the day. Amara, always thoughtful, said, "You know, Mom, I think Mr. Kesler really does want to make a difference. But I think the real challenge for him is not what he gives, but what he learns." Cassandra smiled, proud of her daughter's insight. "You're right, sweetie. It's not about the money or the recognition. It's about understanding how to make the world better, one person at a time." As they walked into their apartment, Cassandra couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. They had come a long way from that night at Waitress Lounge, when they had been looked down upon, when the world had seemed so stacked against them. Now, they were walking side by side with someone who had learned the value of respect, the true power that comes from understanding and empathy. They weren't done with their journey, but the road ahead felt brighter, more promising. And with each step, they knew that they were part of something bigger, something that had the power to change the world in ways they had never imagined. As the weeks turned into months, Cassandra and Amara continued to witness the changes in Richard Kesler, but their journey wasn't over. There were still challenges ahead. Richard had been making progress, but Amara could sense that he still had a long way to go. While he had made big promises, actions often spoke louder than words, and the road to redemption was not a smooth one. However, there was a quiet strength in the way he was trying. One evening, Richard called Cassandra and Amara to a meeting at Kesler Tech's headquarters. It was a grand building located in the heart of San Francisco, a symbol of power and wealth, but tonight it felt different. Richard had invited them to see firsthand the initiatives he was putting in place, the programs designed to give back to the community, especially to the underprivileged youth who had often been ignored by the very institutions that were supposed to support them. As they entered the high-rise lobby, Cassandra was struck by how different the atmosphere felt compared to her previous visits. There was no air of arrogance or superiority. Instead, there was a genuine sense of purpose in the air. Richard greeted them with a smile that no longer seemed forced. "Welcome," he said, shaking their hands. I wanted you both to see what we've been working on. This is just the beginning, but I think you'll be pleased. They were escorted through the building, passing by large conference rooms and offices, but Richard led them to a new floor, one that had been transformed into a community center. It was bright and welcoming, filled with students and staff working together on various projects. There were kids learning coding, others involved in creative writing classes, and even some who were working on environmental projects aimed at cleaning up the city's parks and streets. Richard walked Cassandra and Amara through the space, explaining the different programs, the scholarships, and the partnerships with local schools that had already started to make a difference. This is what I want Kesler Tech to stand for, Richard said. Not just tech or business, but being a force for good in the community. Cassandra could see the passion in his eyes as he spoke, and for the first time, she truly believed that he was committed to his promises. But Amara, as sharp as ever, didn't let herself be swept up by the enthusiasm. She knew that words and gestures could only go so far. This is a great start, Amara said, looking directly at Richard. But this isn't just about giving money or building fancy spaces. It's about making sure these kids know they're worth more than the labels people put on them. It's about teaching them that they're more than just a statistic or a project. Richard nodded, clearly taking her words to heart. I agree, he said, his voice quiet. That's why we've partnered with local organizations to offer mentorship programs, not just financial support. I've learned that it's not enough to throw money at a problem and hope it solves itself. As they walked through the center, Richard stopped to speak with a few of the students, asking about their goals and how the programs were helping them. The connection between him and the young people was real, and it was clear that they respected him for his sincerity. It was no longer about a powerful businessman trying to buy goodwill. It was about a man who had learned the true meaning of responsibility. Later that evening, as they left Kesler Tech's building, Cassandra turned to Amara. What do you think? She asked. Amara didn't immediately respond, her gaze fixed on the city skyline. Finally, after a few moments, she spoke. It's a start, but it has to be more than just this. It has to be something real, something that goes beyond just a few programs or donations. It has to change the way people think, the way they see each other. Cassandra smiled. I think you're right. But at least now, we're on the right track. Over the following months, Richard continued his efforts to integrate these new initiatives into his company's culture. He worked tirelessly to ensure that Kesler Tech didn't just profit from the tech industry, but also invested in people, in their futures, in their dignity. Amara, while still skeptical at times, couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Not just in the work Richard was doing, but in the way he had grown as a person. It wasn't perfect, and there were still hurdles to overcome, but it was clear that the change had begun. As for Cassandra, she knew the journey wasn't over. There were still many challenges to face, but she felt hopeful. She had seen firsthand how one person, even a child, could spark something bigger than anyone had imagined. And in that moment, she realized that change wasn't just about big gestures. It was about the small moments, the quiet acts of kindness, the everyday decisions to do what was right. And as long as people like Amara, with their unwavering strength and clarity, continued to challenge the status quo, there was always hope for a better future. Months passed, and the ripple effect of the changes Richard Kesler had begun at Kesler Tech started to show. Cassandra and Amara had watched from the sidelines as Richard continued to build on his promises, turning his company into a more inclusive place, one where diversity was no longer an afterthought, but a central goal. While Cassandra had seen the impact of these efforts in the community, Amara remained cautious, always questioning whether the changes would last or whether they were just another fleeting gesture. Despite her skepticism, she couldn't ignore the tangible difference she saw. At school, she heard whispers about Richard's initiative to fund scholarships for underprivileged youth, and she saw the news covering the partnerships Kesler Tech had made with local organizations to provide job training for young adults. It felt like something real, but Amara still couldn't shake the feeling that there was more work to be done. One evening, Richard invited Cassandra and Amara to a local event where Kesler Tech was unveiling a new educational program. It wasn't just a press release or a donation. This time, it was a hands-on program where young people would have the opportunity to work at the company, gain mentorship, and eventually secure full-time positions. The event was filled with excitement, but Amara's eyes were sharp. She wasn't easily impressed by a fancy presentation or well-crafted speeches. She had seen too many people in power make promises, only to break them when things got difficult. As Richard took the stage, he looked out over the crowd of eager young faces and their families. The energy in the room was palpable, and for the first time in a while, Richard felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had come a long way since that night with Amara at Waitress Lounge, and he knew the work wasn't done, but this felt like a moment of progress. Tonight, Richard began, we are taking a step forward. Kesler Tech is proud to announce a partnership with local schools, offering internship programs for students who have traditionally been left behind. We are not just giving them jobs. We are giving them opportunities. Opportunities to learn, to grow, and to build a future they deserve. The applause was deafening, but Amara remained still, her eyes focused on Richard as he spoke. She couldn't help but think of the many others who had been given opportunities only to be left to fight for scraps. Richard finished his speech, and as he stepped down from the stage, he walked directly to Cassandra and Amara. I know it's not perfect, he said quietly, but I hope you can see how committed I am to making a difference. Amara nodded slowly, but her expression remained thoughtful. It's a start, she said, her voice steady. But you have to remember that this isn't about programs or money. It's about changing the way people see others, about giving them the respect they deserve from the start. Richard didn't respond immediately. He looked down at Amara, her words sinking in deeper than he expected. He had been so focused on the big gestures that he had overlooked the deeper, more personal aspect of the change that was needed. You're right, he said finally. Respect can't be earned just by doing the right thing sometimes. It has to be a part of who we are, from the beginning. Cassandra smiled at her daughter, proud of how she was able to hold Richard accountable, no matter how far he had come. The evening continued, but Amara's mind stayed focused on what Richard had said. It wasn't enough to make grand gestures or provide financial support. The true challenge lay in changing the culture, in creating an environment where everyone felt seen, valued, and respected. The next morning, Amara woke up early, unable to shake the feeling that there was more to be done. She walked to the kitchen where her mother was preparing breakfast. Mom, she said, her voice quiet but determined, I think I want to help more. I want to do something bigger than just watching all this happen. I want to be part of the change, not just in the company or the programs, but in how people think. Cassandra looked at her daughter, her heart swelling with pride. What do you have in mind? She asked. I don't know yet, Amara said, pausing for a moment. But I feel like there's something more. I want to start by teaching people how to listen, how to understand, and how to change the way they treat others. I think we can do that, one person at a time. Cassandra reached out and hugged her daughter tightly. I think you're right, and I think you're the perfect person to start. That evening, Amara began drafting her plan. She didn't know where it would lead, but she was determined to make sure that the work her mother had done and the lessons Richard was slowly learning would live on. It wasn't going to be easy, but Amara knew that the change they had started could make a real difference. And if there was one thing she had learned, it was that even the smallest voice could echo louder than the noise of the powerful. As the months passed, Cassandra and Amara watched as the world around them began to shift in ways they hadn't expected. Richard Kesler's efforts to change Kesler Tech had been met with resistance at first, but slowly, the impact of his actions started to show. Not just in the company, but in the communities he had worked so hard to uplift. It wasn't always easy, and there were many days when it felt like the fight for respect, for true equality, was a battle they were still losing. But in the midst of the challenges, there were signs of progress. Amara had taken her first steps into activism, working alongside Richard to mentor other young people and teach them the value of self-respect, kindness, and the power of their voices. She had started to give talks at local schools, encouraging students to believe in their own potential, regardless of the world's judgments. You can't change the world overnight, Amara had told the students at her last talk. But you can change the way people see you, and in doing that, you change the way the world sees everyone else. Her words struck a chord, and the ripple effect began. Slowly but surely, more young people started to stand up for themselves, to demand the respect they deserved, just as Amara had. Meanwhile, Richard had become more than just a businessman. He had become a mentor to the very people he once overlooked. He spent his days working closely with the underprivileged youth, guiding them through their education and careers, showing them that their worth wasn't determined by their background or their appearance, but by their resilience, their dedication, and their ability to dream. At the same time, Kesler Tech had begun offering scholarships and job placements to young adults who had once been excluded from the tech industry. Richard knew that it wasn't enough to just provide jobs. He had to create a culture where everyone, no matter their background, was given the same opportunities to succeed. The work was difficult, and the road was far from smooth. But every step forward, no matter how small, felt like a victory. As Cassandra watched her daughter's transformation, she knew that this was just the beginning. She had always hoped Amara would grow up to be someone who would change the world. But what she hadn't anticipated was that Amara would become the catalyst for that change. Amara's quiet strength, her ability to stand up for what was right, had inspired not just the people around her, but Richard as well. In many ways, Richard had learned as much from Amara as she had from him. He had learned that true leadership wasn't about holding power over others. It was about using your position to lift people up, to give them the tools they needed to succeed, and most importantly, to help them believe in their own worth. One evening, as Cassandra and Amara sat together in their small apartment, reflecting on the changes they had seen in the world around them, Amara turned to her mother. "Do you think we've made a difference?" she asked. Cassandra smiled, her eyes filled with pride. "I think we've made more of a difference than we'll ever know. But one thing is certain, we've shown people that it's possible, that even the smallest voice can change the world." Amara nodded, a soft smile on her face. "It's not about changing everything all at once. It's about doing what we can, when we can, and trusting that the rest will follow." Cassandra wrapped her arm around her daughter, holding her close. "You've taught me so much, Amara. I'm so proud of you." The two sat in silence for a moment, knowing that their journey was far from over. But they were no longer fighting alone. They had each other, and they had a world that was slowly, but surely, starting to listen. As the sun set over the city, casting a warm golden light over the streets, Cassandra felt a deep sense of peace. They had come so far from the days when they were just a mother and daughter, struggling to be seen, to be heard. Now, they were part of something bigger. They were part of a movement that was changing lives, one person at a time. And though the road ahead would still have its challenges, they knew they were ready. Together, they had the strength, the vision, and the heart to make the world a place where respect was never optional, where dignity was never for sale. The end was just the beginning, and they were ready for whatever came next. This is a powerful journey through Black stories that reveal the strength, resilience, and determination of those often overlooked in society. A young Black waitress, Amara, challenges a billionaire CEO in a public setting, showing how even the smallest voice can shift the dynamics of power. As she teaches those around her about respect, dignity, and equality, this Black story unfolds with a message of hope and change. From the challenges she faces in her daily life to the impact she makes in the tech world, Amara's journey is a reminder that Black stories have the power to reshape the future. Richard Kesler, the billionaire CEO, begins to understand the real meaning of respect and humility as he witnesses the impact of Amara's words and actions. As the story progresses, Kesler works to make lasting change in his company, creating opportunities for those who have been left behind. This is more than just another success story. It is a Black story that shows the power of using influence for good. The transformation of these characters, from a mother and daughter to a powerful force for change, proves that Black stories are vital to the narrative of societal progress. As the world slowly begins to listen and recognize the importance of equality, these Black stories will continue to inspire others to stand up for what is right.